The fluorescent lights in the community center's main hall buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Sarah Martinez sat in the back row, her weathered hands folded neatly in her lap, watching as the Riverside City Council meeting devolved into another shouting match. At 62, she had learned the art of invisibility, keeping her head down, her voice quiet, her presence unremarkable. "We don't need more programs for these people," sneered Councilman Derek Morrison, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd, especially not ones run by unqualified individuals who think they know what's best for our community. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The program in question was her proposal for a veteran support initiative, something desperately needed in their small California town where too many former servicemen and women struggled in silence, just as she had for decades. Morrison's eyes swept the room until they landed on her. "I mean, look at who's proposing this. Sarah Martinez, a janitor at the high school. What possible qualifications could she have to understand the complex needs of our veteran population?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through some sections of the audience. Sarah felt the familiar burn of shame creep up her neck, the same feeling she'd carried for 40 years since returning from a war that no one wanted to talk about, serving in roles that no one wanted to acknowledge. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight, "we have real experts in this field. Dr. Peterson from the VA has already submitted a comprehensive plan that doesn't require throwing taxpayer money at feel-good programs run by," he paused dramatically, "well-meaning but inexperienced volunteers." Dr. Peterson, a man in his 40s who had never served a day in uniform, nodded approvingly from the front row. His proposal would funnel the funding through existing bureaucratic channels, ensuring that most of the money would go to administrative costs rather than direct veteran support. Sarah's best friend, Maria Gonzalez, sitting 2 seats away, reached over and squeezed her hand. Maria's husband had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and still woke up screaming some nights. She knew better than anyone why Sarah's program mattered. "Maybe we should hear from Ms. Martinez herself," suggested Councilwoman Janet Fields, the only member of the 5-person council who had shown any interest in Sarah's proposal. "She's been working with veterans in our community for over a decade on a volunteer basis." Morrison waved dismissively. "I'm sure she means well, but meaning well isn't enough. We need proven expertise, not amateur hour." Sarah stood slowly, her knees protesting after years of mopping floors and cleaning classrooms. The room seemed to stretch endlessly before her, filled with faces that ranged from curious to hostile to pitying. She cleared her throat, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "Councilman Morrison," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "you're right that we need expertise. The question is, what kind of expertise matters most?" Morrison leaned back in his chair with a condescending smile. "Well, enlighten us, Ms. Martinez. What expertise do you bring to veteran affairs beyond your janitorial experience?" The words hung in the air like a slap. Sarah could hear Maria's sharp intake of breath, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. This was the moment she'd dreaded for 40 years, the moment when her carefully constructed invisibility would either protect her or crumble entirely. "I bring the expertise," Sarah said quietly, "of someone who knows what it's like to come home from war to a country that pretends you were never there." Morrison's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "That's very poetic, but we need concrete qualifications, not emotional appeals. I bring the expertise of someone who served in roles that the military didn't officially acknowledge for decades. Someone who watched friends die and couldn't even talk about it because our missions didn't exist on paper." The room had grown completely silent now. Even the air conditioning seemed to have paused its constant hum. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Martinez, I appreciate your personal experiences, but this is about professional credentials, not war stories." Sarah nodded slowly. You want professional credentials, Councilman Morrison. You want to know what qualifies me to understand the complex needs of our veteran population? She reached into the small purse she'd carried to every council meeting. For the past 6 months, the purse that contained her carefully prepared notes and budget projections that no one had bothered to read. But now she pulled out something else entirely, a small wooden box that she'd kept locked away for 4 decades. Morrison leaned forward, his expression puzzled. "What exactly are you—" "These," Sarah said, opening the box with trembling fingers, "are my qualifications." The medals caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in golden flashes. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal, Combat Medical Badge, and others. So many others that the small box could barely contain them all. The silence in the room was deafening. Morrison's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Dr. Peterson's confident posture had deflated entirely. Even Councilwoman Fields, who had supported Sarah, stared in shock. 42 years ago, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, I was Sergeant Sarah Martinez, 1st Cavalry Division, attached to Special Operations Command. I spent 2 tours in classified operations that saved lives and changed the course of battles that history will never record. She lifted the Purple Heart, its ribbon faded, but the medal itself still gleaming. I earned this when our convoy was ambushed outside a village that doesn't appear on any official maps. I kept fighting with shrapnel in my leg and shoulder until every one of my soldiers made it to safety. The Bronze Star came next. This one was for an operation where we extracted a downed pilot from behind enemy lines. Took us 3 days through hostile territory. The pilot was someone's son, someone's husband. He went home to his family because of what we did. Morrison had shrunk back in his chair, as if the medals themselves were weapons pointed at him. The room remained frozen, every person afraid to move or speak. Sarah's hands were steady now, as she lifted the final medal from the box, one that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "And this," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "is the Medal of Honor." The Medal of Honor seemed to pulse with its own energy in Sarah's weathered hands. The distinctive blue ribbon with its 13 white stars caught the harsh fluorescent light, but it was the medal itself, the Bronze Star surrounded by a wreath of green laurel, that commanded every eye in the room. "Impossible," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. "The Medal of Honor recipients they're all documented, public knowledge." Sarah's smile was sad and knowing. "Not all of us, Councilman. Not when the operations were classified, at levels that made our very existence inconvenient for official records." Dr. Peterson had gone completely silent, his face a mask of professional composure, cracking under the weight of revelation. The veterans scattered throughout the audience were sitting straighter now, recognition dawning in their eyes. They understood the significance of what they were witnessing in ways that the civilians could not. November 15th. 1982, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the cadence of an official report. "Firebase. Charlie was under siege. Enemy forces had us surrounded, outnumbered 4 to 1. Our communications were down, our supply lines cut. The brass had written us off." She held the medal higher, and the room seemed to lean forward collectively. "I was the senior medic, but when our CO went down in the first wave, command fell to me. 17 soldiers under my responsibility, most of them barely out of high school. The enemy was closing in, and we had maybe 6 hours before they overran our position entirely." Maria Gonzalez was crying openly now, understanding for the first time why her quiet friend had always known exactly what to say when her husband came home broken from Afghanistan, why Sarah's hands never shook when dealing with trauma that would paralyze others. "The evacuation helicopters couldn't reach us, too much ground fire, so I made a decision that probably should have gotten me court-martialed instead of decorated." Sarah's voice carried the weight of decades, of choices made in moments when seconds meant the difference between life and death. Councilwoman Fields found her voice first. "What did you do?" Sarah's eyes met hers across the room. "I left the firebase, alone, In the middle of the night, I crawled through 2 miles of enemy territory to reach their command post. Morrison was shaking his head as if he could deny the reality unfolding before him. That's suicide. No one could. I had advantages they didn't expect. Sarah continued calmly. I was small, quiet, and they weren't looking for a woman. In 1982, female soldiers weren't supposed to be in combat roles, remember? I was officially a medical support specialist, not a combatant. Their intelligence never accounted for someone like me. She began to pace slowly, and the room tracked her movement like a predator they suddenly realized had been hiding among them all along. It took me 4 hours to reach their position. Another hour to set the charges properly. When I triggered the explosion, it didn't just take out their command structure, it created enough chaos for our helicopters to finally get through. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then moved beyond discomfort into something approaching reverence. All 17 soldiers under my command made it home, Sarah said simply. Some of them had families. Some of them went on to have children, grandchildren. Some of them probably live right here in Riverside, and you've never known that they're alive because of what happened on a night that officially never existed. Morrison's political instincts finally kicked in, and he attempted to regain control of the situation. Ms. Martinez, this is all very impressive, but even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't change the fact that Dr. Peterson's proposal has already been vetted through proper channels. Sarah turned to face him directly, and something in her expression made him stop mid-sentence. Dr. Peterson, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. How many veterans have you personally counseled through PTSD episodes? Dr. Peterson straightened his tie nervously. Well, I've overseen numerous programs, reviewed countless case studies. That's not what I asked. Sarah's tone was patient but implacable. How many veterans have you sat with at 3 in the morning when they're reliving firefights that happened 20 years ago? How many have you talked down from bridges, pulled out of bottles, convinced to stay alive for one more day? The doctor's silence was answer enough. Sarah turned back to the council. I've done all of those things, not as part of any official program, not for any government salary, but because I recognized the look in their eyes, because I understood what it meant to come home to a country that had moved on while we were still fighting wars that never officially happened. She began returning the medals to their box, each one wrapped carefully in tissue paper that had yellowed with age. Miguel Santos, you all know him. He runs the auto shop on 3rd Street. 3 tours in Iraq, came home with injuries that weren't just physical. He was planning to end his life 2 years ago, until I spent a week sitting with him, sharing stories about coming home to silence. The room stirred. Miguel Santos was well known in Riverside, respected for his honest business practices and community involvement. No one had known about his struggles. Patricia Williams, she served as a helicopter pilot in Afghanistan, first woman in her unit to log combat hours. She's been working at the DMV since she got back, and every helicopter that flies over town sends her into panic attacks. We've been meeting monthly for 3 years. Sarah closed the box with a soft click that seemed to echo through the room. James Parker, David Chen, Rosa Valdez, Michael O'Brien. I could give you a list of 37 veterans in this community who are struggling with invisible wounds, not because they're weak, but because the transition from warrior to civilian is one of the hardest challenges any human being can face. She looked directly at Morrison, and every single one of them has been failed by the existing system. By programs designed by people who've never held a rifle, never made decisions where other people's lives hung in the balance, never woken up in a cold sweat, wondering if they could have saved one more person. Morrison was no longer sneering. The political calculation was clear in his eyes. He had just publicly humiliated a Medal of Honor recipient. In a community where veterans' issues mattered, where military families made up a significant portion of the voting population, this was political suicide, but Sarah wasn't finished. The program I'm proposing isn't about bureaucracy or funding streams or administrative efficiency, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. It's about creating a space where veterans can be understood by someone who's walked the same path, where they can talk about experiences that civilians will never truly comprehend, no matter how well-meaning they are. She picked up her purse and the medal box, preparing to leave. You want qualifications, Councilman Morrison? I've given you 40 years of them. The question now is whether this community is going to support its veterans or whether it's going to let politics and pride stand in the way of people who need help. The room erupted as Sarah walked toward the exit. Sarah had made it halfway to the door when Morrison's voice cut through the eruption of voices behind her. "Wait just a minute." She turned slowly, her expression neutral. The room fell silent. Again, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in Riverside's usually mundane political landscape. Morrison stood behind the council desk, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. You can't just drop a bombshell like that and walk away. If what you're claiming is true, and I'm not saying it is, then why has this never come to light before? Why are we just hearing about this now? Sarah set her purse down on a nearby chair and faced the council directly. The medal box remained in her hands, solid and real and undeniable. Because, Councilman Morrison, some of us were taught that service means serving without recognition. Some of us were told that the highest honor was having our contributions remain classified forever. Dr. Peterson leaned forward, his professional skepticism overriding his earlier shock. The Medal of Honor isn't something that can be kept secret. The process, the documentation, the ceremony, it's all public record. Sarah's smile was bitter. Dr. Peterson, in 1982, there were operations happening that required deniability at every level. When the mission succeeds, it never happened. When someone does something extraordinary during a mission that never happened, she shrugged. What do you think happens to the recognition? Maria Gonzalez stood up from her seat, her voice shaking with emotion. I've known Sarah for 15 years. I've watched her help my husband through nightmares that the VA couldn't touch. I've seen her drop everything to drive 2 hours to talk a veteran through a crisis. She's never asked for recognition, never asked for payment, never asked for anything except the chance to help. Other voices began to join hers. Miguel Santos, the auto shop owner Sarah had mentioned, stood near the middle of the room. Sarah saved my life, he said simply. When the official counselors gave up on me, when my family didn't know what to do, she sat with me for 6 days straight until I remembered why I wanted to live. Morrison's political instincts were screaming warnings. The room was turning against him, and these weren't abstract policy debates anymore. These were personal testimonies from constituents he needed to win elections. Even if all of this is true, he said, his voice defensive, it doesn't change. The fact that Dr. Peterson's program has proper oversight, established protocols that have failed every veteran in this room, Sarah interrupted, her patience finally wearing thin. Established protocols that treat symptoms instead of causes, that process paperwork instead of healing people. She opened the medal box again, but this time she pulled out something else, a folder that had been beneath the medals, its edges, worn from handling. You want oversight, Councilman? You want established protocols? She opened the folder and began reading. Case File 1, Marine veteran, 3 tours, came to the VA with PTSD symptoms, prescribed medication, scheduled for group therapy. Waiting list, 6 months. Result: suicide attempt within 3 weeks of initial appointment. Morrison started to speak, but Sarah's voice rose to override him. Case File 2, Army veteran, female, sexual assault survivor dealing with trauma from both combat and military. Sexual trauma, referred to specialist. Wait time, 4 months. During the waiting period, self-medication with alcohol, loss of employment, eviction from apartment. She flipped through pages, her voice growing stronger with each case. Case file. 3. Navy veteran, disability rating pending for 2 years, living in his car while waiting for benefits determination. Official channels, endless forms, repeated examinations, bureaucratic delays, unofficial intervention. Sarah Martinez connecting him with temporary housing, job placement and peer support while the system figured itself out. Dr. Peterson was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Ms. Martinez, those are isolated incidents. The system helps thousands of veterans. The system processes thousands of veterans, Sarah corrected. There's a difference between processing and helping. She closed the folder and looked around the room. How many of you know veterans? Raise your hands. Nearly half the room responded. How many of those veterans have had positive experiences with the existing VA system? Most of the hands went down. Sarah nodded grimly. That's not an indictment of the people working in the system. Most of them are good people trying to do their best within a structure that's fundamentally broken. But it is an indictment of a system that treats veterans like numbers instead of human beings. Councilwoman Fields leaned forward. Sarah, what exactly are you proposing? Walk us through your program. Sarah pulled out a thick document from her purse, clearly not something she'd thrown together at the last minute. Peer support networks, led by veterans with proven track records of successful reintegration. Crisis intervention, available 24/7, not during business hours. Job placement assistance that understands the unique skills veterans bring to civilian work. Housing assistance that doesn't require 6 months of paperwork. And family support, because PTSD doesn't just affect the veteran, it affects everyone who loves them. She held up the document. Total budget, 60% of what Dr. Peterson's program would cost. Administrative overhead, 12%, compared to his 43%. Direct veteran contact within 48 hours of initial request for help, not 6 months. Morrison was frantically calculating political damage. And who would oversee this program? Who would ensure accountability? Sarah's smile was sharp. The same person who's been ensuring accountability for the last 15 years while you've been giving speeches about supporting our troops. Me? The room stirred again. Veterans were nodding, family members were wiping their eyes, and even some of the previously skeptical council members were looking thoughtful. But there's one more thing you need to understand, Councilman Morrison, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. This isn't really about my qualifications, is it? This is about the fact that I'm a woman, I'm Hispanic, and I clean floors for a living. This is about the fact that in your mind, heroes look different than I do. Morrison's face went pale. That's not... I never said... You didn't have to say it, Sarah replied, but everyone in this room heard it anyway. She picked up her purse and the medal box again. The vote is scheduled for next week. You have 7 days to decide whether this community is going to support a program that actually helps veterans, or whether you're going to let prejudice and politics condemn good people to continued suffering. As she walked toward the door, her voice carried one final message. And Councilman Morrison, next time you want to question someone's qualifications, you might want to ask what those qualifications are before you assume you already know. The door closed behind her with quiet finality, leaving the room in stunned silence and Morrison facing the political fight of his life. The week following Sarah's revelation had transformed Riverside in ways no one could have predicted. The story had leaked beyond the community center walls, first through social media posts by attendees, then picked up by the local newspaper, and finally exploding across regional news outlets when a military historian confirmed the authenticity of Sarah's service record. Now, 7 days later, the community center was packed beyond capacity. Veterans from 3 counties had driven in to attend the vote. News cameras lined the back wall, and Councilman Morrison sat at the council desk looking like a man facing his own execution. Sarah entered quietly, wearing the same simple blue dress she'd worn to every previous meeting. But everything else had changed. Veterans stood as she walked down the aisle, not in organized formation, but in spontaneous recognition of rank that transcended official protocols. The Medal of Honor was a sacred thing in their community, and seeing it in the hands of someone they'd watched serve silently for decades had awakened something powerful. Morrison gavelled the meeting to order, his voice tight with tension. We're here to vote on Proposition 7A, the Veteran Support Initiative proposed by Sarah Martinez. The formal language couldn't disguise what everyone knew. This vote would determine Morrison's political future and, more importantly, the fate of dozens of veterans who desperately needed help. Dr. Peterson stood first, his prepared statement clearly revised multiple times during the week. After careful consideration and consultation with VA officials, I believe there may be merit in exploring alternative approaches to veterans support services. It was a politician's surrender, technically supportive while admitting no wrongdoing. Sarah watched him with the patience of someone who had outmaneuvered enemies in circumstances where the stakes were life and death, but Morrison wasn't ready to concede. While I have the utmost respect for Ms. Martinez's service record, he began, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man with nothing left to lose, I still believe we need to consider the long-term sustainability and professional oversight of any program we implement. Miguel Santos stood up in the audience. Councilman Morrison, what professional oversight do you think Sarah's been operating under for the last 15 years? Because whatever it is, it's worked better than anything else this community has tried. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Morrison's face flushed. Mr. Santos, while I appreciate your personal testimony, we have to consider the broader implications. The broader implications, interrupted a voice from the back of the room, are that you publicly humiliated a Medal of Honor recipient because she didn't fit your image of what a hero looks like. The speaker was a tall man in his 70s, wearing a leather jacket covered in military patches. He walked slowly down the aisle, his cane tapping against the linoleum. Colonel James Hartford, 1st Cavalry Division, retired, he announced. I commanded operations in the region where Sergeant Martinez earned her decorations. Sarah's eyes widened. In recognition, Colonel Hartford had been a legend among the Special Operations community, a man whose tactical brilliance had saved countless lives in conflicts that would never be officially acknowledged. I've spent the last week, Hartford continued, confirming details that have been classified for 40 years. Making phone calls to people who swore they'd take certain secrets to their graves. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. I have here the complete after-action reports from Firebase Charlie, witness statements from all 17 soldiers under Sergeant Martinez's command, and most importantly, the recommendation for the Medal of Honor that was signed by every officer in the chain of command. Morrison was gripping the edge of the council desk so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Colonel, I'm sure this is all very interesting, but the recommendation, Hartford continued, ignoring the interruption, that was classified and buried, because acknowledging it would have required admitting that we had combat operations in places where we officially had no presence. He opened the folder and began reading. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty, Sergeant Sarah Martinez, through her extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty, saved the lives of 17 American soldiers while surrounded by numerically superior enemy forces. The room was completely silent. Even the news cameras had stopped their quiet whirring. She wasn't just recommended for the Medal of Honor, Hartford said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. She was awarded it in a classified ceremony attended by 3 generals and witnessed by soldiers who were sworn to secrecy. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face. For 40 years, she had carried the burden of unrecognized service, of heroism that existed only in the memories of those who had been there. Hartford turned to face Morrison directly. Councilman, You questioned this woman's qualifications to help veterans. Let me ask you, what qualifies you to question her? Morrison's political instincts finally kicked in, and he began the desperate pivot that every politician learns when facing inevitable defeat. Colonel Hartford, I want to make it clear that I have never questioned Ms. Martinez's service or her dedication to our veteran community. That's exactly what you did, said Councilwoman Fields, speaking for the first time during the meeting. We all heard it. The recording is public record now. Morrison looked around the room desperately, but found no allies. Even the council members who usually supported him were avoiding eye contact. Look, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Maybe I was hasty in my initial assessment. Maybe we can find a way to incorporate Ms. Martinez's program alongside Dr. Peterson's. No, Sarah said quietly, standing for the first time during the meeting. There's no compromise here, Councilman Morrison. Either this community decides to support veterans with programs that actually work, or it doesn't. Either you trust people who've walked the path to guide others down it, or you continue to trust bureaucrats who've never left their offices. She walked to the front of the room, and every veteran in the audience stood with her. I didn't reveal my service record to embarrass you or to win political points, she continued. I revealed it because veterans in this community are dying while they wait for help that never comes, because the system you're so eager to preserve has failed every person in this room who's ever needed it. Morrison was now visibly sweating. Ms. Martinez, I think we can all agree that your program has merit. The vote is yes or no, Councilman, Sarah interrupted. Support the veteran community or continue to fail it. There's no middle ground when people's lives are at stake. The moment stretched endlessly. Morrison looked around the room one final time, saw the wall of veteran faces staring back at him, and understood that his political career was over regardless of how he voted. All in favor of Proposition 7A? He said, his voice barely audible. 4 hands went up immediately. Morrison's remained at his side for a long moment before slowly rising to join them. Motion passes unanimously, he whispered. The room erupted in cheers, but Sarah was already walking toward the exit, her quiet dignity intact even in victory. 6 months after the vote that changed everything, the Riverside Veterans Support Center occupied a converted warehouse on the edge of town, its large windows letting in streams of morning sunlight that illuminated spaces designed for healing rather than bureaucracy. Sarah stood in the main gathering room, watching as Miguel Santos led a group session for recently returned veterans, his own journey from despair to purpose, serving as living proof that recovery was possible. The transformation had been remarkable, but it hadn't been easy. Morrison had resigned 2 weeks after the vote, his political career effectively ended by his public humiliation of a Medal of Honor recipient. The local newspaper had endorsed his opponent in the subsequent special election with an editorial that began, "Sometimes it takes real courage to recognize heroism that doesn't match our preconceptions." Sarah heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Colonel Hartford approaching, his cane still tapping rhythmically against the polished concrete floor. In the months since the council meeting, he had become an unofficial advisor to the program, his decades of military experience helping to navigate the complex bureaucracy of veteran services. "The morning report," he said with a slight smile, handing her a tablet displaying the center's statistics. 43 veterans served this month. Average wait time for initial contact, 18 hours. Crisis interventions, 12, all successful. Job placements, 8. Housing assistance, 15 veterans moved from temporary to permanent housing. Sarah scrolled through the numbers, but they told only part of the story. Behind each statistic was a human being who had found their way back from the edge, who had remembered that their life had value beyond their worst moments. "Patricia Williams got her pilot's license reinstated," Sarah said, pointing to a note. "In the margins. She's going to start flying medical transport helicopters. Says she wants to save lives instead of just surviving." Hartford nodded approvingly. "Purpose heals faster than any medication." Through the large windows, Sarah could see the parking lot filling with cars as the day shift volunteers arrived. Many of them were veterans themselves, people who had found healing through helping others navigate the same difficult path. The peer support model that had seemed so radical 6 months earlier was now being studied by VA officials from across the state. Dr. Peterson appeared in the doorway, looking somewhat sheepish. In the aftermath of the council meeting, he had quietly approached Sarah to volunteer his services, acknowledging that his academic expertise could be valuable when combined with real-world experience. His pride had taken a beating, but his commitment to helping veterans had proven genuine. "Sarah, the state evaluation team is here for their final assessment," he announced. The state funding that had initially seemed impossible was now not only possible but probable. The Riverside model was showing results that traditional programs couldn't match, and bureaucrats who cared more about outcomes than protocols were taking notice. Sarah walked toward the front entrance, passing through spaces that hummed with quiet activity. In one room, a job counselor who had served 3 tours in Iraq was helping a Navy veteran translate military skills into civilian job qualifications. In another, a family support group led by military spouses was providing guidance to the wives. And children of veterans struggling with PTSD, the evaluation team was led by a woman in her 50s, wearing a crisp business suit and carrying an expensive briefcase. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Career bureaucrat, accustomed to dealing with programs that existed more on paper than in practice. "Ms. Martinez?" The woman extended her hand. "I'm Director Susan Chen from the State Veterans Affairs Office. We're here to assess the effectiveness of your program for potential statewide implementation." Sarah shook her hand, amused by the formal introduction. 6 months earlier, she had been invisible to people like Director Chen. Now, her program was being considered as a model for the entire state. "I'll be happy to show you around," Sarah replied. "But I think you'll learn more by talking to the veterans we serve than by looking at our paperwork." Director Chen's expression suggested she was more comfortable with paperwork, but she nodded politely. "Of course, we'd like to conduct interviews with program participants as part of our assessment." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah watched as the evaluation team's skepticism gradually transformed into amazement. They spoke with veterans who had found jobs, housing, and hope through the program. They reviewed crisis intervention records that showed a success rate far beyond anything achieved by traditional methods. Most importantly, they witnessed the transformation that occurred when veterans were helped by people who truly understood their experiences. Miguel Santos had been particularly effective in his interview, describing his journey from suicidal despair to program volunteer with a directness that left the evaluators visibly moved. "Sarah didn't save my life with forms and appointments," he had told them. "She saved it by sitting with me when I was ready to give up and showing me that someone who had been where I was could still find reasons to live." As the evaluation concluded, Director Chen pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. Her official demeanor had softened considerably during the day. "Ms. Martinez, I've been working in veteran services for 20 years, and I've never seen results like this. Your model is achieving outcomes that our best programs can only dream about." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but remained modest. "It's not about the model, Director Chen. It's about recognizing that healing happens through human connection, not administrative processes. Which is exactly why we want to expand this statewide," Chen continued. "We're prepared to offer funding for 50 centers based on your template. Training programs for peer counselors, standardized protocols adapted from your methods, oversight structures that maintain program integrity while allowing local flexibility." It was everything Sarah had hoped for when she first walked into that council meeting 6 months earlier. The chance to help veterans across the entire state, not just in Riverside, but she also understood the danger. "Director Chen, the moment this becomes about bureaucracy instead of service, It will fail. The moment we start measuring success by processed paperwork instead of healed lives, we'll become just another broken system. Chen smiled. Which is why we want you to head the statewide implementation. Full autonomy, adequate funding, and the authority to maintain program standards regardless of political pressure. Sarah looked around the center that had grown from her quiet determination to help fellow veterans. 6 months earlier, she had been a janitor whose voice nobody heard. Now she was being offered the chance to transform veteran services across the entire state. "I'll consider it," she said finally, "but only if the program remains veteran-led, veteran-focused, and veteran-accountable. The moment it becomes another government agency, I'm out." Chen extended her hand again. "Ms. Martinez, I think that's exactly the attitude we need." As the evaluation team left, Sarah stood in the parking lot watching the sunset over Riverside. The town looked the same as it had 6 months earlier, but everything had changed. Veterans who had been invisible were now seen. Voices that had been silenced were now heard. And a woman who had served her country in silence for 40 years had finally found her voice. Colonel Hartford approached, his cane tapping against the asphalt. "So, are you going to accept their offer?" Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in decades. "I think it's time to stop serving in silence, don't you?" "Sergeant Martinez," Hartford said with a formal salute. "It's been an honor serving with you." Sarah returned the salute, understanding that after 40 years, her real service to her country was just beginning.